Good morning. We had the opportunity last week to pray for Rob, our senior minister, and to send him with blessings over a few weeks of sabbatical. So Rob will be gone this summer, taking some much needed time for refreshment, for rejuvenation, and we, the rest of your ministerial staff, are excited to spend the summer with you. We're excited about the series we're kicking off today. We're also excited about all of the things Amy started to mention in the announcements about what's happening with our kids and students this summer. And I hope you're excited about that too. If you are new this morning, my name is Kate. I'm the Connection and Care Minister, and we're really glad that you decided to join us today. My great-grandmother, Ina, was a sweet, God-loving Pentecostal woman. She had 10 children. Now, sadly, her husband was in prison. She would be quick to tell you, though, that George's incarceration was an unfortunate misunderstanding. His friends were the ones committing the crime, the robbery. George was only there watching what happened. Ina would call him a bystander, but the judge called him a lookout. My great-grandmother just could not attest to that. My dad says that George was a rough guy. Nobody would have been surprised by the crowd he rolled with or the actions that landed him behind bars. But Ina. We joked that George and Ina are a snapshot of our family tree, a mixture of God-fearing and felonies. And last weekend, one of my dad's cousins brought around a card George had made for Ina, Christmas 1927, it said on the front. They found it while clearing out my great aunt's house. And all of the doodles and the hand lettering, it says right here, "You are love's great gift to me," were kind of surprising to see the softness that could come from George. Ina saw only the best in her husband, and that brought out the best in him. All of us have something in our family that might tempt us toward denial or therapy. We all have a cousin Eddie or an Uncle Fester or something maybe a little less funny and a little more sobering in our family history. Abuse or neglect or addiction. A pattern of conflict or of control. An event that severed generations and relationships. We've all got something in our families. For those who grew up with some biblical literacy, the patriarchs of Genesis are names that you would know and recognize. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. And if you were like me as a kid, you might have assumed, because these were the guys God was using to bring about his plan to establish a people, that these were like the cream of the crop examples on the righteousness front, that these were people who we were supposed to look at and learn from how to live our lives. But we're opening up the book of Genesis to look at the life of Joseph this month, and let me tell you, a fresh look may leave a little bit of a bad taste in your mouth. We follow the same family for generations, and they are messy. They are messy. We are not supposed to read Genesis and model our lives after the patriarchs. A better lens, though, might be to look at what we're observing in their lives and see what that might teach us about the character of God that we find in their stories. And so our story, we are spending June focusing on the story of Joseph. We are introduced to Joseph in chapter 37 of Genesis. He is a young man of 17. He's a shepherd along with his half-brothers. And verse 3 tells us Jacob loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age. We see quickly the language this text has is chosen really carefully. Almost all of it links back to other stories of Joseph's ancestors. Jacob loved Joseph more than all of his other sons, because Jacob was the obvious favorite of his mother Rebekah, while his brother was the obvious favorite of his dad Isaac. He was a son of his old age, which is the exact language Abraham used to describe his son Isaac, also a second-born, who was a favorite among the family tree. Joseph comes from a family history of division and deceit. We have generations of parents who chose favorites, who unwillingly pitted siblings against each other, whose family dysfunction was cyclical and inherited. A legacy of jealous men who manipulate compulsively, they lie to save their own behinds and to get ahead. Joseph has been born into conflict in his family system. His father, Jacob, had been raised in a household of obvious favoritism. And so Jacob had manipulated his twin brother, stolen his birthright, fled his homeland, was tricked into marrying a woman he did not realize he was marrying, ended up marrying sisters who had their own fierce competition to produce him an heir and to be the most loved. Jacob was swindled by his father-in-law, and eventually he returned and reconciled with his brother. This is Joseph's father. And so Joseph was the 11th son of his father Jacob, but his favorite, because he came from the wife that Jacob loved the most. Joseph's brothers, hotheads. Previous chapters of this book detail some of the heinous crimes they've committed before Joseph was of age, including a murderous revenge plot, incest with their father's maidservant. The sons of Jacob are impulsive, entitled, and angry. But not Joseph. Joseph is his father's favorite. And I can tell you this with certainty, thousands of years after the fact, because it is so clear and so obvious in this family that it is printed right here in the text. Joseph was Jacob's favorite son, so he gave him a beautiful, multicolored, multi-patterned coat. And his brothers seethed with envy. Now, Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him. And they just could not speak a nice word to him. If Joseph is guilty of anything at 17, he might not have a lot of discernment to read the room. He might be a little self-interested. Because when Joseph has an interesting dream, he runs to the wrong audience to tell the tale. Joseph had a dream, verse 5, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. Listen to this dream I had, he says. We were binding sheaves of grain out of the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it. Gee. His brothers said to him, do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us? And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. And then he had another dream. And in this one, listen, I had another dream. This time the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. And when he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him. He said, what's this dream that you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down before you? His brothers were jealous of him, but his fathers kept the matter in mind. So in Genesis chapter 37, Joseph is not a sympathetic character at the moment. Poor kid. But it is a curious proposition. Why is Joseph having these dreams? Do they mean something? We're going to get to revisit their significance in a couple of weeks. But right here, Joseph is not deserving of the hate he received from his brothers because of it. The envy in their hearts turns hateful and into murderous intentions. One day, Jacob sent his son Joseph to check on his brothers and the flocks of sheep, and they saw him coming. They said, here comes that dreamer. Come now, let's kill him. Let's throw him in one of these cisterns and say a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we will see what comes of his dreams. What a terrible idea. What a horrendous idea to murder Joseph, to spill his blood in an open field, to deny him proper burial, which is just a sacrilege to the people, by the way, and then to cover it up with deceit. This is the plan. This is how far their hearts have fallen. The eldest brother, Reuben, maybe has enough guilt or shame or common decency to direct his brothers not to do anything rash. And so instead, they throw Joseph into a pit. And they sit down to eat a meal. And they're deciding what to do with him, supposedly while Reuben is away out of the picture, and a caravan comes through. And they sell Joseph into slavery. The brothers keep the coat, they destroy it, they bring it back to their father, deceiving him into believing Joseph has been killed by wild animals. Joseph is sent into exile. Now, exile is a major theme of this story, not unlike other patriarchs in the book of Genesis. Joseph loses his family, he loses his homeland, his cultural identity, and he is sent away, far away from all that is safe and familiar and his. Exile is like a death. Death of his promised future, death of his relationship with his brothers, his place in his father's home. Then they got Joseph's robe, they slaughtered a goat, they dipped the robe in the blood, they took the ornate robe back to their father, and they said, "We found this. Examine it to see whether it's your son's robe." He recognized it. He said, "It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." And then Jacob tore his clothes, he put on sackcloth, and he mourned for his son for many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." And his father wept for him. It feels really significant to pause here and to survey the damage, especially if you're familiar with this story, just how terrible it actually is. Because this is a story that is not easily reconciled. What happens to Joseph here in chapter 37 is the beginning of a bitter saga that spans more than 20 years before it finds its resolution. And did you catch Jacob's language? He will go to the grave in mourning. Exile is a form of death, but death is also a form of exile. This family has been shattered, and Jacob doesn't even know how severely. He does not know that his sons have betrayed him, that they've had a hand in this. At 17, Joseph is cast into a pit, exiled from his family, from his homeland, from his foretold future, and he is trafficked to Egypt. This is a story of human trafficking and slavery. He is sold into the house of Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, in Egypt. Now, if you know the rest of the story, you know miracles happen. People are saved and redeemed. God has been present throughout. But God did not stop Joseph's brothers from sinning. God didn't save Joseph from being sold or from being exiled. And you might be tempted to say a very common but very incorrect statement as a theological truth, that everything happens for a reason. Kate Bowler is an academic. She's an author and a professor at Duke Divinity School. She studies and teaches religious history and wrote the first book on the history of the prosperity gospel in America. You know, the idea that God blesses believers with health and with wealth. And in 2015, she was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer at the age of 35. She wrote a memoir living through the experience called Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies That I Have Loved. In the midst of dealing with the cancer, she wrote an op-ed for the New York Times about the irony of being an expert on health and wealth and wellness and happiness while dying and being ill, being sick. And it went viral. It received loads of correspondence from people around the globe. In her memoir, she writes, "Most everyone I meet is dying to make me certain. They want me to know, without a doubt, there is a hidden logic to this seeming chaos. Even when I was in the hospital, a neighbor came to the door and told my husband that everything happens for a reason. I'd love to hear it," he replied. "Pardon?" she said, startled. "The reason that my wife is dying," he said in that sweet and sour way, effectively ending the conversation as the neighbor stammered something and handed him a casserole. "Christians want me to reassure them that my cancer is all part of a plan. A few letters even suggest that God's plan was that I get cancer so I could help people by writing the New York Times article. Easy." There is circular logic to these attempts to explain the course of any life. If you inspire people while dying, the plan was for your life that you would become an example to others. If you don't, and you die kicking and screaming, the plan was that you discover some important divine lessons. Either way, learn to accept God's plan. It's well-meaning. I understand the intention, and I hear it a lot. But do you know this isn't true? It's not something found in Scripture. It's actually derived from moral philosophy, from Aristotle, trying to explain cause and effect. Everything happens because something happened to make something else happen. Those looking for good vibes everywhere has co-opted this statement. They've confused it as gospel truth, that God causes everything to happen. It's meant to be a comfort, that our trauma is justified because it's part of a bigger plan. That's not comforting or true. God does not cause people to sin. God does not need human wickedness to accomplish his goals. Yeah, God is in control. We do not have to worry that the powers of the world, of wickedness, of evil, of mere man can thwart the will and plan of God. Nothing is more powerful than God. Nothing surprises him. Nothing overpowers him. But as a just God, he doesn't puppet master us. Though in times of hardship, we sometimes really wish that he did. Sometimes he steps in. Sometimes he doesn't. Sometimes he's working behind the scenes. Sometimes we ascribe a spiritual reason to a situation that was just broken, fallen. When we cling to this false promise that everything happens for a reason, we don't leave room to grieve the terrible things that have happened. Yeah, God is going to use the evil done to Joseph for his ultimate good. That does not mean the evil done to him was the plan. God does not wish for man to act in evil. God does not wish for families to be torn apart. Joseph was cut off from his home, from unity and harmony with his family. That is the opposite for God's design and dream for the family. Redemption is not the same as reason. Everything does not happen for a reason, but God can redeem what happens. Romans 8:28 says that we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. And sometimes this is going to look like redeeming a bad situation. And sometimes it's not. And so we continue in Joseph's story and we jump to chapter 39 in Potiphar's house. This is where we first notice the presence of God in Joseph's story. Verse 2 says that the Lord was with Joseph and the Lord gave him success in everything he did. Joseph quickly rose in rank and responsibility because of God's favor on him, and Potiphar put him in charge of his entire household. Joseph, the foreign slave, was making lemonade out of lemons. But this is the descent. So a good thing cannot stay a good thing. The text says, now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance, and it came about after these events that his master's wife had her eyes on Joseph, and she said, sleep with me. He refused. With me in charge, he told her, my master doesn't concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you're his wife. So how could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? Good for Joseph. He is making the right choice. He's doing the right thing, trying to stay honorable to God and to Potiphar. One day he went into the house to attend his duties, and none of the household servants were inside. She caught him by his cloak and said, come to bed with me. But he left his cloak in her hands and ran out of the house. When she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, she called her household servants, look, this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me. But I screamed, and when he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak behind and he ran out of the house. It is of note that this is the second time Joseph has been stripped of his cloak today and ceremoniously stripped of his favor and his safety that goes along with it. First, the coat that his father gave him, his status as a favorite son, his place in his family of origin. This time, a cloak he earned for himself as a trusted individual, even as a stranger and a slave in a strange land, falsely accused, safety jeopardized. This woman tells the same story a few different ways to a few different people, and Potiphar has no choice but to throw Joseph in jail. There goes that. But while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness. He granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all of those held in prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. What is God doing here? God's with him. He's causing him to succeed, while simultaneously all of these very unfair things are happening to Joseph. He's not controlling human behavior. He's not orchestrating human behavior, but God is granting favor and wisdom and discernment to a young man looking to live with integrity in spite of a bad hand being dealt to him again and again and again. Sometime later, there is another set of 2 dreams. Remember the dreams from earlier? This time from 2 prisoners that Joseph was attending to, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker of Pharaoh himself. We do not know what happened to get them into this situation, and I'm only going to touch on these briefly, but each had a dream and is lamenting the hidden meaning. They had these dreams, they don't know what they mean. But God will reveal the meanings of the dreams this time to Joseph. He tells each man their fate. The baker is going to be put to death. The cupbearer will be restored to his position. And Joseph makes a point to ask him, when all goes well with you, remember me. Show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh. Get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews. And even here, I have done nothing to deserve being put in this dungeon. This is the first we've heard Joseph vocalize his own situation and draw attention to how aware he is of the unfortunate, unfair set of circumstances that he's in. When he describes his prison, he calls it a dungeon. In the text, the same word as pit from chapter 37. Joseph calls it a pit. Joseph has been sitting in a pit ever since his brothers threw him in back in Shechem. He is carrying trauma from the exile of his family and the traumas that have happened to him ever since. And at this point in the story, it has been 11 years. Joseph is 28, and he is still sitting in the pit. Are you familiar with the pit? I'm not talking about a bad day. Some of us think God has abandoned us after like a missing alarm and a parking ticket. I was running late from the office the other day, ironically working on this sermon. I needed to grab something from home and then do daycare pickup. I live 5 minutes up the road, just on the other side of the railroad tracks. And on my way home, I hit 2 trains. And then I got what I needed from the house, got back in the car, and I hit another train on the way to daycare. And I lamented, "God has left me," loudly in the car. It was in jest. My husband laughed, but I still heard it. You know, God only gives his toughest battles to his strongest soldiers. Nope. None of us is promised an easy life. We all face a season in the pit at one time or another. A loss knocks the wind out of you. A future that felt assured crumbled into dust. Your identity was built on something unstable, and you're not sure what's left when it's gone. You find yourself alone, untethered. Nothing is going according to plan. Everything feels like an uphill battle, and you aren't even sure if it's worth getting back up due to our own actions, the actions others have taken against us, circumstances, situations we've inherited and we find ourselves in. We're in a pit. Even Jesus tells his disciples in John 16, "In this world you will have trouble." He says, "But take heart. I have overcome the world." God does not keep bad things from happening to Joseph. This is a long season of descent for him. But God has not forsaken him. He's right there with him. God's promise to us is not for prosperity. It's not for protection. God's promise is for his presence. When Joseph is in the pit, he is not alone. When we're in the pit, it doesn't mean God isn't there too. God is there. When Joseph is in the pit, there is still more to come. Like I said, this is a 22-year story. When we're in the pit, it does not mean the story is over. When Joseph is in the pit, he knows a God that he still chooses to rely on. And when we are in the pit, it doesn't mean that God isn't still good. God's still good. But frequently, what God does from the pit is in spite of what put us there, not the way things would have gone if we didn't live in a fallen world. 3 days later, the dreams of each man came to fruition, as Joseph interpreted. And so Joseph has proven some supernatural favor and discernment from God to a very connected individual with some very powerful people. He has to be thinking that this is his moment. But verse 23 ends, the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. Joseph will continue to wait in the pit. Even when he's exalted, which Amy is going to dig into next week, he doesn't leave the pit behind. It takes 20 years for Joseph's exile from his family to be resolved. 20 years for this unforgiven hurt. 20 years to wait for reconciliation. What I love about Joseph is he's a cycle breaker. You remember the legacy he's inherited, the family traits that he could embody, the postures he could take in several chapters of this story. But we see Joseph make different choices than his fathers and seek to be faithful to God in spite of circumstances. In the midst of this, what we know to be true is that God is there with Joseph. That God will shape him, that God will use him, and that God has a way of elevating the unexpected and redeeming broken things. And so as we approach the table now for communion, I invite you to get out the communion you picked up on the way in. We're invited into the presence of God to remember the lengths that Jesus went to bring us back to himself, dying on the cross and beating death in the resurrection. And as we take the bread and cup in a moment, we have an opportunity to remember the presence of God. The pit is not the end of the story. If you're there, if you've been there, are you aware that God is in there too? That you, like Joseph, are not abandoned. God has invited us into a relationship with him, no matter what we're dealing with, what we've endured, no matter where we're at. If we accept that love, he's there with us. Amen and amen. And so let's take the bread together now. And let's take the cup. And I'd ask you, where you're at as you take the bread and the cup, to sit for a moment. Close your eyes, maybe extend your hands if that's kind of your thing. Sit for a moment now in the awareness of the presence of God before you.